After studying this module, you shall be able to know what the study of public finance is all about and the different roles played by the government in an economy. Learn about the interaction between the public and the private sector regarding several economic functions in an economy. Analyze the rationale behind different public sector activities by the government as suggested from the study of public finance.
In simple terms, the branch of public finance studies the role of the government in an economy. Often, economists share contrasting views and therefore raise fundamental questions regarding the actions of the government. Therefore, the goal of the public finance is to understand the proper role of the government in an economy. By observing various economies at the current time, we may come up with questions like why is the government the primary provider of essential goods and services like highways, education, unemployment insurance, while the provision of other goods and services such as clothing, entertainment is generally left to the private companies. On the expenditure side of the public finance, we can ask what kind of goods and services should government provide if at all it has to provide. Similarly, on the revenue side of the public finance, we may ask how does the government raise the funds necessary for such expenditure? What kind of taxes should be levied and on whom? And finally, what would be the resulting effect of such action on the economy as a whole? The subject of public finance tries to answer these fundamental questions by studying the role of the government in an economy.
The branch of public finance studies the role of the government in an economy. Often, economists share contrasting views and therefore raise fundamental questions regarding the actions of the government. Therefore, the goal of public finance is to understand the proper role of the government in the economy. By observing various economies in the current time, we may come up with questions like why is the government the primary provider of the essential goods and services like highways, education, while the provision of other goods and services such as clothing, entertainment is generally left to the private companies? On the expenditure side of public finance, we can ask what kinds of goods and services should the government provide? Similarly, on the revenue side of the public finance, we ask how would the government raise the funds necessary for such expenditure? And finally, what could be the resulting effect of such action on the economy as a whole? The subject of public finance tries to answer these fundamental questions by studying the role of government in an economy.
For example, in recent past, the government's share of economic activity is over 20% of the GNP, whereas in the Western Europe, the share of the government expenditure as percentage of the GNP is over 50%. This observation also reveals the steady disagreement among the policymakers about whether the role of the government should expand or should go down or should remain constant. The subject of the public finance also discusses these issues to understand the changing role of the government in a nation. Let us now discuss the role of the government in public finance sector. According to some economists, the first function of any government is to establish and enforce the rules of economic games, which includes laws defining property rights and liabilities, legal enforceability of contracts, provisions for bankruptcy. These are considered as the ground rules set by the government for the proper functioning of both the private and the public sectors. But as we are concentrating on basic economic activities of the government, such as allocation of resources, distribution of output, and stabilization of the economic activities for modern mixed economies. We will try answering few questions that capture all these fundamental aspects of public sector activities.
The term finance loosely suggests monetary flows represented by the revenue and the expenditure activities of the governmental fiscal process. Nevertheless, the basic economic functions of the public sector are those that influence allocation of resources, distribution of real output, and effective demands among population. And finally, the aggregate economic performance. These three basic functions form the government's part. Allocation, distribution, and stabilization are viewed as the targets or the objectives of the public sector economic activities. Therefore, the subject matter of public finance mainly deals with the theoretical models as well as empirical tools to explain and analyze the role of the public sector. Let us understand the role of the government by answering the four fundamental questions. When should the government intervene in the economy? How might the government intervene? What is the effect of those interventions on the economic outcomes? Why do the governments choose to intervene in the way that they do? These questions essentially capture all fundamental aspects of public sector activities.
In the absence of government intervention, competitive market equilibrium guarantees efficient trade outcomes between consumers and producers through the free adjustment of price resulting demand equal to supply. A trade is efficient if it makes at least one party better off without making the other party worse off. Competitive market outcome maximizes the number of efficient trades and hence maximizes efficiency. Therefore, the reason for the government intervention in some market economies are the market failures and redistribution. The first motivation for the government intervention in a private market is due to the presence of market failure. In economics, market failure is defined as a problem that causes the market economy to deliver an outcome which does not maximize efficiency. One example of such a situation is the presence of negative externality in a market. Negative externality occurs in a market when a consumer's decision imposes on others a cost that the consumer does not bear. For instance, we can think about the market for private health insurance where there are hundreds of consumers to buy health insurance and hundreds of private insurers to provide. But still, we find that there exists a huge number of people without any health insurance plan. The decision of these consumers pose a health risk cost on other people in the society as they have the greater chance of falling ill. In this case, government intervention through regulation or through price mechanism corrects the negative externality problem. The second reason for government intervention is redistribution, which means shifting of resources from some groups of individuals in the society to others. The government can intervene with the motive for redistribution even in the absence of market failure when the competitive market maximizes efficiency. The government intervention in such cases can be justified on the equity ground where the government thinks that resource allocation by the market economy is unfair towards some groups in the society. Such action on the government's part is often criticized as it involves an equity efficiency trade off, which means that in order to get a fairer distribution of resources, there is a social efficiency loss. Therefore, the first fundamental question in public finance justifies the need for government intervention in a mixed economy.
The first question discusses the motivation for government intervention in an economy. In a modern economy, all kinds of allocation decisions are made through either of the two institutions, the market and the government. The market institution is designated as the private sector and the government institution as the public sector. Allocation function in private sector is carried out by the market forces such as supply demand laws and price mechanisms. Public sector allocation, on the other hand, is accomplished through the expenditure and revenue related activities under government budgeting. Therefore, the first motivation for government intervention in market is due to the presence of market failure. It is a problem that causes the market economy to deliver an outcome which does not maximize efficiency. The second reason for government intervention is redistribution, which means shifting of resources from some groups in the society to others in order to maintain equity in the society. The next question is, how should government intervene? This deals with the different approaches that the government can take to intervene. The frequently used methods are the following. First, tax or subsidize private sale or purchase. This approach corrects any form of market failure through price mechanism. Imposing a tax raises the price of a commodity that is overproduced in case of negative externality, and imposing a subsidy lowers the price of a commodity that is underproduced in case of positive externality. Secondly, restrict or mandate private sale or purchase. This approach proposes a direct method of government regulation where public sector can directly restrict or mandate the quantity and the price of a commodity in private market. For example, regulation of wearing a seat belt while driving is a government mandate. Thirdly, public provision. The public sector itself provides certain goods and services directly to the society when those are not available in the market or underproduced by the private producers. For example, government schools and hospitals. Lastly, public financing of private provision. This approach indicates the situation when government wants to influence the consumption level of its citizens and does not want to get directly involved in the provision of goods and services. In such cases, government can finance the private entities to provide the desired amount of a particular good in the society. In addition to all this, government also has another role to play by deciding between several alternative options to intervene. This question deals with the cost benefit analysis of the public sector to evaluate alternative policy options. Answering the third fundamental question of public finance, what would be the effect of government intervention on the society, requires the government to critically analyze the consequences of each public policy in order to evaluate its immediate as well as long term effect on the society. This is the branch of public finance that employs the empirical tools to analyze the impact of public policies. Another important issue discussed in theory of public finance is that any government policy involves two effects on society. First is a direct effect which occurs when individuals do not change their behavior in response to a policy change, and the second is an indirect effect which must be considered when individuals change their behavior in response to the intervention in the society. The final effect of a policy must include both these effects.
Let us now discuss scope of public finance and why should we study public finance. We will also try to discuss facts on the functions of the governments around the world in the coming sections. As we have seen in the previous section, the study of public finance is important to understand the proper role of the government. Why do we need the public sector in a modern mixed economy is a normative question in economics which explains how things should be done when private markets cannot deliver an efficient outcome to the society. Therefore, the motivation to study public finance comes from the dominant role played by the governments in every economy around the world. In the next section, we will briefly highlight some of the key facts regarding the government's role in various developed nations.
Finally, to answer the fourth fundamental question of public finance, why governments act the way that they do, we focus on the theory of political economy in public finance, which describes the government not as a benevolent actor who maximizes the welfare of the citizens, but as an agent with political motives. The theory also discusses the social, political, and historical forces that shape a current fiscal institution and the problems like preference revelation and preference aggregation. Government faces a huge problem to figure out what millions of people want and how to aggregate their want into a unique public policy. Theory of political economy also claims that government and the politicians face a political pressure while taking a decision. Let us now briefly highlight some key facts regarding the government's role in various developed nations. The amount of government expenditure as a percentage of GDP indicates the level of government intervention and plays a crucial role for the public provision in a country. Government expenditure as a share of GDP across developed nations from 1960 to 2000. The graph shows a steady growth in government spending for countries USA, Sweden, Greece, and the average of industrialized nations as a part of Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. The striking fact found from the figure is that although government spending as a share of GDP has grown across all developed nations, the pace at which that growth occurred varies across countries. While USA experienced a modest growth over time, almost all European nations experienced a much larger growth in government. Another interesting feature of government's activities is the changing pattern of government finances as reflected in the government's budget. The graph shows the government revenue and spending for US federal government from 1930 to 2000. As we can see in the graph, except between 1941 and 1945, during the period of World War II, US federal government's budget was more or less balanced. The pattern that we have seen from the trend and revenue can be understood from the trend in deficit or surplus for US federal government from 1930 to 2000. In this figure also, except between 1941 and 1945, budget was more or less balanced. This trend continued till the late 1960s, after which the deficit grew relatively larger to be 5% of GDP. The deficit shrank significantly during. The same trend is mirrored in the level of government debt for US federal government from 1930 to 2000. The debt to GDP ratio rises significantly between 1941 and 1945, and after that, over the period, it somewhat balances out. This trend motivates us to ask the following policy questions. Why do some governments face budget deficit relatively more than the other countries' governments? Let us now see the sectors that have a larger propensity to receive public provision or government spending. It also captures the changing composition of central spending over time as a share of total spending. As shown in the figure, federal government spending in US is mostly in national defense, that is 49.5% of total spending, and social insurance programs such as Medicare, Social Security. Let us now see the sectors that have a larger propensity to receive public provision or government spending. It also captures the changing composition of state government spending over time as a share of total spending. State and local governments spend mostly on education, 34.2%, public order and safety, 13%, transportation, other 20.2%, social services.
Let us now discuss the relevance of public sector today and the changing role of the government. The important role played by the government in our lives makes the study of public finance an interesting and relevant subject at any point in time. By looking at the trends and the features of the public sector activities, we can look at some of these basic questions. Those questions remain the focus of the current policy debates and news. The importance of the role of the government is acknowledged in public finance, but the changing pattern in that role across nations is what motivates the policy debates among economists. For example, in the US, the three areas which receive maximum attention regarding government's role in the recent past are the social security, healthcare, and education. In all classes, the debate was on whether the role of the government is too conservative or too liberal, and what could be the possible impact of such policies on the overall economy. This same argument is valid for any country in the world regarding any public policy.
Besides all of the discussed roles of a government in an economy, government also perform as a regulatory body controlling our social and economic activities. This is called the regulatory role of the government. For example, the food and medications that we buy from a store are all subject to the approval of the Food and Drug Administration body of the government.
In this module, we have learned about the concept and the nature of public finance as a subject. This introductory module on public finance explains the concept and nature of public finance as a subject. The goal of public finance is to understand the role of the government and public policy in a country. The four fundamental questions asked in public finance that capture the various roles played by the government, including when a government should intervene, that is, the need for the government intervention, how the government can intervene, that is, the tools for government intervention, what could be the result of such intervention, means the cost benefit analysis, why do the governments choose to act the way they do, that is, the question of the political economy. The scope of public finance as a subject is motivated through various stylized facts from the government activities around the world. This shows the trends in government spending, government budgetary deficit, public debt, distribution of spending, and finally the regulatory role of the government. The changing role of the government in public finance keeps the subject interesting and relevant forever. This also makes public finance a great subject for policy debates.
In this module, you have learned about the concept and nature of public finance as a subject. The important role played by the government in our lives makes the subject of public finance an interesting and relevant course at any point in time. By looking at the trends and features of the public sector activities, we have motivated some questions based on that. The importance of the role of the government is acknowledged in public finance, but the changing pattern in that role across nations is what motivates the policy debates among the economists. For example, in the US, the three areas which receive the maximum attention regarding government's role in the recent past are the social security, healthcare, and education. In all cases, the debate was on whether the role of the government is too conservative or too liberal, and what could be the possible impact of such policies on the overall economy. This same argument is valid for any country in the world regarding any government policy.